All right, we're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone, both in the audience, if everybody can get settled and quiet. So I want to welcome everybody who's in the audience and then remind you that we are live streaming this. So we have hundreds of people watching this around the country. And when we get to the question portion of the program, both everyone in the audience as well as everyone watching will be able to text in questions. So welcome again. I'm Jean Sachs. I'm the CEO of Living Beyond Breast Cancer, and I am pleased to welcome you to our 10th annual conference for women living with metastatic breast cancer. It is incredible that we've been doing this for 10 years, and I welcome you to the community. I know there are some of you that have been here year after year, and there are many that are new. So this is a wonderful opportunity for you to get to know each other. We're going to start off the conference with a panel discussion that is going to be moderated by Elaine Shatner. But before I introduce her, I just want to kind of remind everyone that Living Beyond Breast Cancer really has been focused on the needs of women living with metastatic breast cancer for many years. We did a needs assessment in 2005 that identified many of the issues of concern and unmet needs of this population. And we built out a lot of programs, including this conference, as well as publications, making sure our helpline always had women of different stages, different ages. And so we've been very committed to trying to meet the needs. So it is really exciting to have the 10th annual conference, and this is also our 25th year as an organization. So we are celebrating, and there'll be lots of ways for you to do some fun things. So I'm going to introduce you to Elaine Shatner. She is both a physician and a journalist and a women's health advocate. And mid-career, she confronted a number of personal health conditions, including breast cancer, and she says that was when she really realized how hard it is to find accurate information and to navigate your care decisions. So she is a true advocate, and we are really pleased that she will moderate this discussion.
Well, thank you, Jean. I'm honored to be here. And for this hour, my job is really to keep us on track and to hear your voices. And so I hope not to have to cut anyone off. We'll keep our questions short and our responses short. I just want to say that we have two topics for this evening, and they're completely different in some ways. One is about precision medicine and science, and sort of what's new for metastatic breast cancer. And we'll discuss that, and then we'll move on to patient advocacy, and we'll consider the role of advocates in progress and in addressing the needs and the unmet concerns of people who are living with metastatic breast cancer. So with that introduction, I'll introduce my co-panelists. To my right and your left is Musa Mayer. Musa is a woman I've known for about 8 years now, and I think of as an advocate's advocate. She has been involved with the metastatic breast cancer community since the early 1990s, when she started one of the first listservs on the internet. She's written a book. She's written several books, but one is about living with advanced disease. It was first published in 1997. Musa serves on the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance panel, and really it's a privilege to have her with us today. To my left and your right is Dr. Nikhil Wegle. And Nick is on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. He is an oncologist who works at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and he is a scientist who works at the Broad Institute, which is a center in Boston for genetics and research having to do largely with cancer. And then to my left, we have Dikla Benzivi, who has a very interesting background. Dikla is a patient advocate who has been living with metastatic disease for almost 14 years. And And it's well documented, okay? So I should say that since the time of her diagnosis, Dikla has worked tirelessly, it seems by her biography, to help others who are affected by this. She has now the largest Facebook group for women with or for people living with metastatic breast cancer that's on the internet. She does peer-to-peer sessions for people living in the LA and West Coast area. She lives in Culver City, I learned today, and she'll have the opportunity to tell you more about her work later. So we should start with the first topic, which is precision medicine. So I'm going to start with the longest question and the longest answer for Dr. Wigley. Can you tell us a little bit about what is precision medicine and what it means for people who are living with metastatic breast cancer?
Sure. So first I just want to say thanks for inviting me, and it's a real honor to be here on the panel and with so many people and so many people who I've learned a lot from, especially over the past year. Precision medicine is not a new concept in cancer, and it's definitely not a new concept in breast cancer, although it is a new name, and it's taken on new meaning. When I think about precision medicine, I think about it's the use of genomic or molecular or clinical or pathological information to make a decision about using the right treatment for the right person at the right time. Right? So that's the big picture. That's kind of how I think about precision medicine. And when you think about it, precision medicine then includes deciding whether a breast cancer is ER positive or HER2 positive or triple negative, because that makes us decide what treatments to use. Or to use a test that we've been using for many years now called Oncotype, which helps us understand whether we should use chemotherapy in the early stage setting. But really, when we talk about precision medicine today, we mean all of those things, but we mean one additional thing, which is to use the latest molecular and genetic technology to really find the Achilles heels of cancers. So to look and say, what's special about this cancer that we can take advantage of? What are the vulnerabilities, and what medicines do we have available to us that we can use to exploit those vulnerabilities? And so that's the promise of precision medicine, and that's what lots of researchers have been trying to do for the last several years, which is to understand what these vulnerabilities are and then what drugs we should use to match to those vulnerabilities. And the vision is that when someone is diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, we can look at their tumor and we can create a genetic or molecular fingerprint of that tumor, and we can say, aha, this is the right drug to use. So how good are we at doing that? In metastatic breast cancer, we've been making a lot of progress in that area, although it's still early days, I would say, for precision medicine. And there are a number of really promising treatments in all of the different subtypes. There are really promising precision medicine treatments in ER-positive breast cancer, in HER2-positive breast cancer, and in triple-negative breast cancer. And I think the next phase is really starting to figure out how to implement that well.
I have a question for Dikla. As a patient or a patient advocate, do you think you know enough about precision medicine? Is it a big mystery?
Well, I think for myself, I read a lot online and I try to inform myself on the science behind metastatic breast cancer, its treatments, its mechanisms of action. But there's always more to learn. I've noticed that at the basics, it's what drives the certain cancer cell, and is there a treatment that can affect that cancer cell and eliminate it, or at least reduce it to a size that doesn't harm us. But it's tough. Not everyone wants to be versed in all the scientific background of every type of cancer, but to know how it works in a general sense, I think is important, because it helps you understand what's going on.
Dr. Wigley is an expert in precision medicine. Not all oncologists are. Do you think that's a problem for some patients, that their doctors don't know how to answer their questions?
Yes, I think that's an issue for a lot of patients. Sort of the doctor-patient communication and being able to thoroughly listen to what the patient is saying and asking and responding in a manner that we understand and we can absorb and learn from. And so that enhancing that communication is very important, and feeling listened to on both ends for whatever the doctor has to relate and we as patients have to relate to them.
Musa, you might be a skeptic. I don't know. Do you think it might be better to wait before signing on to precision medicine? Do you have reservations about the field? What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Nick. We're already there in what will probably ultimately be seen to be a limited way. In other words, we've been treating ER-positive breast cancer with tamoxifen for 30 years? Decades. And tamoxifen, in fact, is arguably the treatment that saved more women's lives with breast cancer than any other single drug, including all the latest. It takes well, I should preface by saying the other thing that I've spent a lot of time doing in advocacy is partnering with researchers and making, trying to understand the very arduous process of validating biomarkers and validating the fascinating findings in precision medicine that are coming so rapidly to us. And I have to say, I find it disheartening, having been an advocate for 25 years or so, to know that in terms of actual validation through clinical trials, we have such a limited arsenal right now of biomarkers. We have HER2, obviously we have the estrogen, and to some extent the progesterone receptors. And certainly we have tools like Oncotype DX. I think it's important to know what not to do, like who not to treat, who treatment is unlikely to be helpful. But I also know, because I've been following Oncotype DX, how long and how complex the research really has been to prove it as a tool that can be used with confidence in the clinic. So I'm not sure what the answer to all of this is, but it seems to me that we are having more evidence than we can process or find the resources to test intelligently, and certainly to bring to the clinic so that patients will benefit from it. And I worry about that because there currently is no system of prioritizing what gets accelerated and what does not.
A question for Nick.
Yeah.
I sometimes think when I read and report on precision medicine in other cancers like melanoma or lung cancer, which were so lethal even just 5 and certainly 10 years ago, that breast cancer is somehow behind in precision medicine.
Yeah.
Do you have any insights about why that is? And can you tell us where we are with metastatic breast?
Sure. I think that's a really interesting point, and it's funny because if you had thought about breast cancer in this idea of precision medicine 5 years ago, or a little more than 5 years ago, you would have thought breast cancer is ahead, because we did have things like HER2. We do have things like HER2 and ER, and had a number of targeted drugs where lung cancer and melanoma had none. And then these discoveries were made in lung cancer and melanoma, which helped us pick treatments that have made, enormous differences in the treatments of those diseases. And we have not made that many of the next discoveries in breast cancer to say, well, what else is there besides ER, besides HER2? We've developed really great new drugs for HER2. Right now there are a series of new drugs that have been approved over the last several years that are now being given in combination for HER2-positive disease that have made a big difference. There are new drugs that target the estrogen receptor that are in clinical trials that look like they're making a difference. But what else is there? I'll say, from my perspective, I agree with everything Musa said about the concerns and about needing the system to be better to help accelerate the right treatments and being able to analyze the data well. But the question is, what do we think is on the horizon? What's available? What might be available soon versus what's the reality today? And the reality today is that we have a limited number of drugs that we use in metastatic breast cancer, many of which work really well for a certain period of time, but we certainly need more. From the research side, I would say there are a number of precision medicine targets that I think are quite promising. For example, we're learning about in ER-positive metastatic breast cancer why cancers become resistant to therapies, why cancers become resistant to hormonal therapies. And that's a type of precision medicine that helps us understand what combinations can we use to overcome that resistance. And now new drugs like CDK inhibitors, like Ibrance, palbociclib, is being helpful in overcoming that resistance. And there are more that are in trials right now. Things like PARP inhibitors in triple-negative breast cancer are really effective for breast cancers that don't have BRCA1 or 2. And that's another form of precision medicine. When you know a breast cancer doesn't have that DNA damage repair protein, PARP inhibitors seem to work really well. And so it's been slow, but we're starting to piece together these different things where we can pick a drug for a specific mutation that we see, and I think those will lead to a lot more advances.
Dikla, do you think that there's a need for patients to be proactive about this, that they should be asking their doctors, are there new drugs for me? Is there a trial? Am I a precision medicine candidate?
I think it's always important for us as patients to ask what's coming up, what's available in clinical trials, and to specifically state maybe not just clinical trials at this institution, but what's available nationwide for me. And because you may be willing to travel, that's something you can relate to your oncologist. I definitely think it's very important. There's always new clinical trials coming out, and to discuss that with your oncologist to say how much does it relate to my situation? How effective do you think it will be? You know, is it the risk versus benefit ratio for each new type of drug? And the caveat is, if it's something you hear about in media, you have to take it with a little bit of grain of salt, because they'll show enormous excitement over a new discovery, and only to realize later when you do more research that maybe it's in the phase 1 trials or stage 1, or it's barely out of the mouse model. And so it's great to hear about it on the news, but then to ask your oncologist, what does this really mean and how does it relate to me? I do want to state that I was doing a little research earlier on, and I did realize that all these therapies that we are now on or that we take for granted, over 90% of them were only released in the last 20 years. Every ER/PR medication out there, which is about 8 or 9 of them, everyone except tamoxifen is from the last 20 years. All the HER2 therapies are from the last 20 years. I'm sorry, 20 years. And all the ovarian suppression therapies, all the bisphosphonate medications, they're all from the last 20 years. The good thing is we take them all for granted, and they've only been around 20 years. The last 7 would have about 7 new treatments offered to us. And I think, yes, we still need more. There's still 40,000 of us dying from it, and we need to reduce that number greatly. We need to discover therapies that extend our life to a normal lifespan. That would be our goal. Minimal side effects, something that maintains our quality of life, and also allows us family planning options for those younger ones who may want children in one fashion or another. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to have either a vaccine or a one-time therapy that eliminates it from our body or makes it a non-risk. That would be fantastic.
I should say we'll be taking questions starting at 6:45 on both topics. So I want to ask my co-panelists a few more on precision medicine, and then we'll move forward. But if you have questions on this topic, send them in. And Jean knows how to do that.
Yes, you can text them, and I think the number can come up on the screen. And Kathy will be sorting through them, so feel free to text them as they come up.
Yeah, and I should remind the audience we're on the internet live, so we'll be fielding questions possibly from across the world, okay, or across the room. Okay. Nick, do you have any thoughts about how clinical trials might be improved to accelerate the safe availability of new drugs that might be administered precisely?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question and gets back to Musa's concern that she raised earlier, which is that right now only about 5% adults in the US with cancer participate in clinical trials. And so we are not taking advantage of clinical trials in the way that we should be to really accelerate this research. And there are a number of reasons for that, but I think one of the major ones is the availability of clinical trials to folks. You know, people can go to major medical centers and may be able to get clinical trials, but not everyone can, and a lot of times you have to travel, and it's actually very intensive. And so if there was a way to be able to democratize clinical trials, so to speak, to be able to have more people able to access clinical trials, I think that would both accelerate the research as well as make these drugs available to more people. The other thing is it's really hard for people to qualify for clinical trials. You know, clinical trials are really restrictive. And there are reasons for that. There are scientific reasons for that. But sometimes there aren't great scientific reasons for that. And I think we need to balance the idea of eligibility criteria and the restrictions of people being able to get onto clinical trials with making these drugs available to more people. So there are more concerns. Those are two of them that I think we should be able to address sooner.
Musa, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
One of the things that the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance found when we analyzed the world of clinical trials is how difficult it is for patients actually to get information that makes any sense to them. Yeah. And so we've been working for the last year on a couple of projects to really enhance how clinical trials are perceived online by patients. There are two tools, one of which is what we call a bubble chart, where you can, if you go to mbcalliance.org, you can find this tool that will sort all the open clinical trials for metastatic breast cancer by various criteria, including subtype, line of treatment, phase of the trial, and so forth. It sort of takes the hundreds of trials that are open now and narrows the field down. And then it takes you to a wonderful tool that breastcancertrials.org has developed, a metastatic trial search, which LBBC and a number of other organizations, the Metastatic Breast Cancer Network being one, SHARE being one, and I think we're expanding it to many other organizations, a simple tool that you can enter the basic information about where you are in your metastatic disease and what phase treatment you need or what line of treatment you need, and it will give you in plain English, comprehensible English, a simple description of a trial and who to contact, which is like an entry. Now, we don't know that these tools are going to actually increase clinical trial participation. I think there are other barriers that stand in the way too, but certainly making them accessible is a very important first step.
Can I just add how important I think that is? Because precision medicine is only as good as being able to then do something about the information you find. And so even if we understand that there's a target, that there's a drug that might be helpful for, if you can't figure out that there's a trial and go enroll on that trial, what's the use?
Exactly.
Okay, well, it happens to be the midpoint, and we'll switch gears. Just as a journalist and a person who cares about the breast cancer community, I encourage all of you to do the best you can to keep up with new findings. I agree with Dikla's point that there is a role for self-education and asking doctors questions. And I know also I am a physician still, I teach at Cornell, and many of my colleagues are prompted to look things up when their patients ask them good questions or bad questions. So ask, really it's part of being a patient and taking care of yourself. So those are my 2 cents. We're going to shift now to advocacy, which I think is a huge topic and one that's dear to most of us here. And I'm going to start with a question from Musa, who really has been in this field, if you will, for some time. And what I want to ask really is how advocacy has changed since you started doing this. Let's say we can limit it to breast cancer or patient advocacy in general.
No, breast cancer, or specifically metastatic breast cancer, which is what all of you care most about, or you wouldn't be here, did not exist 25 years ago in any form. An organization which served as a clearinghouse for all breast cancer organizations, which Jean will remember, called NABCO,
Yeah.
put out a brochure. This is before the internet existed, or it existed, but we didn't know about it yet. They put out a brochure every year, and all that was in that brochure about metastatic breast cancer was some references to hospice materials and something on viatical insurance. In other words, how to sell your life insurance if you knew that your lifespan was limited. That was it. There was nothing else. As far as NABCO knew, and they surveyed all the support groups in the United States, I believe there were 2 among a couple of thousand. It was really a very barren landscape and a very isolating landscape for any woman with metastatic breast cancer, but because I was on the first breast cancer listserv back in 1994, and some of those women were having metastatic recurrences and beginning to talk about it and beginning to discover that aside from the conversations they had with one another, no one understood, no one wanted to hear what they had to say, or that's how they felt anyway. And so that's why I interviewed 35 of them and put their voices into the first book. Now long out of print, all the medical information is way out of date, but it was an important first step to begin to help people connect and find their voices. The next step really started with Living Beyond Breast Cancer, when Elise Kaplan, who's now the advocacy person for Novartis, I don't know if she's here, I know she was coming, called me and said, we want to do a program for metastatic breast cancer. I understand that's your interest as an advocate, and we'd like to do some small focus groups. And I said, let's not do that. Let's take the limited funds that you have and do a large-scale survey. That survey, we expected to get a couple of hundred people online. That survey ultimately was taken by over 600 people, and that became a white paper that we called Silent Voices. And it was essentially a needs assessment. It was saying to women, what do you need? What have your experiences been? What are you looking for? What are the topics you want to know most about? And on the basis of that, which we put online, which LBBC put online, I started going around and doing trainings with different staffs at different organizations like SHARE and others, and found that there was beginning to be a real receptiveness. Like people who worked in various support organizations were really beginning to wake up and realize there was this whole population of patients that they weren't serving, for whom they offered nothing yet, but that it was really important that they do so. And so that was where it started. And from there, it's just proliferated really wonderfully until we sit here today. Many other surveys have been done. There are still great limitations in terms of the changes that those surveys have brought about, but there is a level of public dialogue, and the internet has greatly facilitated that, obviously, that there has never been. It's very gratifying for me to see this finally blossoming, and to see you all here.
So that's interesting that you refer to the silent voices. I should say, as a journalist, I was doing some research this year, and I was looking up a statistic, a controversial statistic. And I should give a nod to a blogger, a woman who lives with metastatic disease, Ann Silverman, who found your document from 2005, which was published by this organization, Living Beyond Breast Cancer, in 2006. And that was the most thorough document I could find last year about survival and other concerns for people living with metastatic breast cancer. And that still is basically the best document on it, which first demonstrates the power of advocacy, because these were advocates who put forth that that paper. And it also shows the need for collecting information, which we'll talk about. Musa, you mentioned the internet, and I was going to ask Jean if you would like to comment on how the internet has changed either this organization, meaning Living Beyond Breast Cancer, and also just advocacy.
Sure.
What's new?
Yeah, well, the internet, I think, has changed everything, right? But I think Musa did a great job of explaining how Living Beyond Breast Cancer early on realized we have to do something for women living with metastatic, that most organizations really weren't willing to talk about it, and we knew we had to understand it better. So that was a really important step. But I have to say, in those days, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Twitter. We called, we faxed a lot. We also did a pen and paper survey as part of that, because we wanted to be able to reach people who weren't online. And information didn't travel very quickly, and it wasn't very easy to find each other. So when we brought women together for our first metastatic conference, actually, maybe many of you can talk about this, it was just to be in a room with other women and to say, oh my God, I live close to you, or you live near my family, and you're finding each other. So now you can all find each other so much more quickly. You can pass information so much more quickly, and we think in many ways that is great. And we also know in many ways it can be overwhelming, and sometimes the information is not relevant to you, or it's scary. And we've certainly heard women say, I just needed to shut it all down for a while because I was obsessed. I was up until 3 a.m, just reading and looking. So for an advocacy organization, it's been amazing for us. We've been able to be much more well-known more quickly. We've been able to get information out more quickly. And that's how we really try to use it. And we want all of you to help us, spread the word about what we're doing. But I mean, it's hard to even remember what it was like before. It really is. I mean, I don't think I've used a fax in a long time.
Well, forget about faxes. Dikla, you do both in-person, peer-to-peer work, and then a lot of internet work.
That's right.
What's the difference, and do they each have value? Do they have distinct value?
They all have value. The one-on-one interaction, I do a lot of peer counseling through many different national organizations, including LBBC and SHARE and many others. And that contact, that verbal contact or in-person contact, means a lot. We're human beings. We derive, relief and comfort from speaking and being with each other, and that's very important. But that's not always possible. We could be living in rural areas or far away from other clinics or other people that are living with metastatic breast cancer. And then the national resources, the online resources, become more valuable. And you can relate to one another via Facebook groups like the one I run online, or chat rooms, or forums, or webinars, or live streaming. It's amazing the plethora of options we now have as metastatic breast cancer thrivers that we did not have 10 years ago. I was part of that Silent Voices. I was one of the 600 that filled out that survey. And back then it was like email networks. I created email networks for metastatic patients. Now it's Facebook groups. And it's nice, the camaraderie, to know what other people are going through, to know if they relate to our situation, what practical advice they can offer, what comfort, the words of encouragement and hope. That has expanded enormously in the last 5, forget 10 years ago. And that's the blessing that we have now, is that we can connect with each other, not just as women living with it, but caregivers as well can connect with each other and learn from each other what's going on, which we did not have 10 years ago. But the one-on-one interaction and the online interaction both have value.
And Musa, do you think that the needs of the community, which is perhaps it's a diverse community, are currently being met by advocacy groups? What needs to happen?
What needs to happen? The Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance has been spending, now it's 3 years, isn't it, Shirley? First, we did a landscape analysis of everything from the current state of research, laboratory research, clinical research, resources. We looked at quality of life. We looked at information, communication between patients and healthcare providers. We looked at a variety of areas, tried to cover the whole landscape of living and dealing with the disease. And we found so many different areas where there are profound needs. And we were also aware, more from the research than, I suppose, than we were able to actually document ourselves, that there is a much larger population of women and some men out there who aren't at conferences like these, who are living very, very difficult lives, who do not have access to the level of health care that hopefully most of you or all of you do. And this is a part of, obviously, the much larger social problem that we live with every day that has to do with access to health care in all areas. So it's a little overwhelming at times to think about all the things which need to be done and where to find the resources to do them and the will to carry that through. But I believe that the more of us become involved, motivated, and knowledgeable, and the more we learn, the more we have tools, like one of my causes is really to get accurate statistics about the prevalence of metastatic breast cancer, which means the number of people who are living with the disease. We don't even know this in this country, or for that matter, anywhere in the world. This is not a known figure. It's very difficult to advocate for a population when you can't count who they are or know who they are. So we're working now with, I won't go into detail because there's not enough time, but it's really exciting with the Alliance now to see so many different organizations working together on different pieces of all the different needs that are out there, to see if we can develop programs to take us a step further towards meeting those needs and trying to influence the whole healthcare system to meet those needs.
Yeah. Well, I'll add, I happen to share Musa's concern about the lack of statistics. It's just, that's basic information. And I think while there is a lot that's being done, it's worth mentioning that the National Cancer Institute and the head of the cancer registries there, Lynn Bernathy, she's really prioritized this issue, and she runs a huge database, what's called the SEER database. It doesn't matter so much as I think the leadership at the National Cancer Institute is working on this. It's still slow, and it's frustratingly hard to get accurate and current information, but it is, I think, a real priority there within the National Cancer Institute. I've had my own conversations with them, and I believe them. I have a question, actually. This is a surprise.
Okay. I love surprises.
We didn't talk about your project at the Broad Institute and the Metastatic breast cancer project.
Yeah.
Do you think that advocacy has a role in that, and that the internet, this is a two-part question, and that the internet has facilitated completion of that project and also potentially other projects that other scientists, maybe even your competitors, are working on?
Yes. So this is a perfect time for that question, actually. And I don't think advocacy just has a role. I think this is all advocacy, right? This project, which I'll describe in a second, is all about taking research and putting it in the hands of patients to drive it. Our goal, when I have my scientist hat on, is to accelerate discoveries in metastatic breast cancer, to speed up our discoveries, to find new treatments, to get things to patients faster. And because of all the things that you guys just described, right, that patients are online, advocacy groups are online, there's quicker communication amongst folks, we realize that now is the perfect opportunity to harness that energy and harness that communication and say, well, then let's put the power of driving the research also in the hands of the patients and the advocates. And so back in October, Corey Painter, who many of you know, who's sitting there, or you should get, and I launched a website in partnership with many of the advocacy groups that are in this room, including LBBC, to try and actualize this, to say, the website's mbcproject.org, and for those of you that haven't seen it, it allows women and men with metastatic breast cancer around the country and really around the world to say, you know, I count, what Moose is saying, and count me in, and say, you give us your name, give us your email address, and say you're willing to share your story, share your medical records, share your tissue, share your saliva with us researchers to try and speed up the process of making discoveries. And so I think this is the new model, or a new model for research, right? That we don't have to just do this in silos. We don't have to just do this in each of our academic centers one at a time and not necessarily even share information, but do this in one big group of patients and researchers and doctors working together to try and put all the data into one big database and share that with everyone. I think that will really speed things up. And so far, in 6 months of doing this, we've had an incredible outpouring of support. Almost 1,800 women and men from all 50 states have signed up. Yeah. And I can't imagine something happening that quickly without advocacy and patients kind of driving it.
Okay, I think it's time to ask for questions from the audience. And
We're going to take them by text.
Right, so
So we have so many questions. Thank you everyone for all your questions. Nick, there's a little confusion about what precision medicine is, immunotherapy, and how it relates to MBC. We have several questions about that. Can you clarify, please?
Sure. So I didn't mention immunotherapy, and I realized that after I stopped talking. So immunotherapy is another really promising approach to treating cancer in general. It's made really amazing strides in melanoma, in lung cancer, in kidney cancer, as well as several other cancers. And it's starting to make an impact in metastatic breast cancer as well, in particular in triple-negative metastatic breast cancer. It's being explored in HER2-positive and ER-positive metastatic breast cancer. Just very briefly, immunotherapy, these are new drugs called checkpoint inhibitors, which essentially take the brakes off the immune system and allow, in some patients, their immune system to fight off the tumor. And what's exciting about it is in patients in whom immunotherapy works, it seems like it may work for a really long time and give people really durable responses to these drugs. We just have to figure out who it will work best in. And so that's why it's part of precision medicine. Precision medicine is really just trying to figure out in metastatic breast cancer which drugs will work well for you, right? Don't give the same drug or the same cocktail of drugs to everyone, but really tailor the therapies to individuals and say, this person, because of the way their tumor looks, is likely to respond to immunotherapy, and that's why we're going to use immunotherapy in you. But you are likely to respond to a CDK inhibitor and a PI3 kinase inhibitor, and that's why we'll give that combination to you. So hopefully that clarifies things a little bit.
Okay. And there are questions about genetic testing, and particularly one person says her understanding is that everyone with metastatic breast cancer should have a full gene panel done. Is that your understanding? Is that your recommendation? And what therapies, what do we know with the full gene panels?
Yeah, I think it's early to say that. So just two clarifications. When we talk about genetic testing and gene panels, we might mean two different things. One is testing the tumor with something called a gene panel or genetic sequencing to figure out what drugs we might use to treat the patient. The other kind of gene panel is genetic testing when we talk about understanding what genes you might have inherited that led to increasing your risk for cancer. That's like BRCA testing that a lot of people know about. Those are two different things, and it's testing two different, the outcomes of those two different tests are very different. One is about your risk for developing cancer. The other is when you have cancer, what drugs might be useful for you. And when we talk about precision medicine, we really mean that testing the tumor and figuring out what drugs might be right for you. It's too early to say that every patient with metastatic breast cancer should definitely have a gene panel. A lot of us believe that. A lot of people believe that. The science is trying to figure out if that's true. Insurance right now doesn't reimburse gene panels. And as we were talking about earlier, it's not like we have hundreds and hundreds of drugs available that once you do the gene panel, you know what to do with it. So we don't have the interpretation. Some of you may have read a New York Times article some weeks ago about how interpreting these tests is really hard. And then even if you can interpret the test, we may not have the drugs. And so until we have all those pieces, it's hard to say every person, especially when they may have to pay out of pocket for it, it's very hard to justify saying that every patient with metastatic breast cancer should have that kind of test. I think we're headed in that direction, but we still have a number of things to do before we get there.
Great. Caregivers. A caregiver is wondering how to advocate for a family member. And Jean, I'm wondering if you have any insight into that.
Sure. Well, I mean, caregivers are so important. I know there are several probably many caregivers here this evening, and we recognize that your role is really important in keeping your loved one's life as normal as possible. I mean, that's really what you want. You want to be able to do as much as you can while you're in treatment and while you're going through constant testing. But I also think it's so important for caregivers to know that it takes a real toll. I remember when my mom was really sick with lung cancer, I was more worried about my father sometimes than my mother. His blood pressure was up, he was exhausted, he wasn't sleeping well. So it is really important that caregivers take a break, find other people to connect with, realize their limitations, which I think can be really, really hard to say, you know what, I want to do everything, but I just can't. I need someone to come in and help. So I think we are all, anyone who has a loving caregiver in their life is so lucky, but we also have to make sure we support them as well.
Musa, there's a lot of concern about the SEER data, and why has it been so hard to count metastatic breast cancer patients?
We do count, or rather SEER does count what is called de novo stage 4. In other words, women who are diagnosed initially at stage 4, and I'm sure there are many here who were. You were counted in the SEER data as having metastatic breast cancer, but the large majority of patients with the disease will have had it as a recurrence. SEER is like a black box in a certain way. It captures data when patients are initially diagnosed, and it captures usually the initial treatment. And then it counts deaths. And everything in between is not captured by cancer registries. And I should say these are state cancer registries that participate in this national program. And this is important not just because we'd like to know how many patients there are. It's important because so much of our health policy is based on registry data, and because it measures everyone in the population, not just the educated, the well-insured, the affluent, not just people who live in cities or suburban areas, but everyone, all the minority populations, people of color, people in every part of the socioeconomic spectrum. And so we know certain things about whole populations. For example, we know that African American women die at much higher rates than white women. And we know that they die sooner, looking at stage 4 patients at initial diagnosis. There is just so much that would have to happen, or that will have to happen, on the basis of each of these state registries. But I can echo what Elaine was saying. NCI is committed to beginning to do some pilot work with their programs to transform and even incorporate patient input into the information that is captured by the SEER registries. It's going to happen much more slowly than we would like, but I think there's this dawning awareness that across all cancers, or most cancers now, you know, it used to be you've got metastatic disease, you died. So there was never a really important reason. Now that people like yourselves are living years with the disease, we need to know about you. We as a society need to know about people who are living with all advanced cancers, their needs, their numbers, where they are, all of those things. So I think it will happen. It's going to be slow and it's going to be costly, like everything else.
Kathy, I'd like to usurp my authority and ask Jean another question, which I didn't have time for before. In terms of advocacy and the work of this organization, LBBC, I mean, we're talking about so many things here. We're talking about patients and advocates and caregivers pushing for research, for information for research, for access to peer patients, for data. And we've referred to the NCI, which has to do with politics and limited funds. I mean, what are the priorities for this organization and for the community, do you think? And how is that changing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to do, I have to say. There's an unending things to do. I mean, for Living Beyond Breast Cancer, our priority is really to provide education and a community of support, because that's what we think we do best. We can bring together the top people in the oncology field to speak with you, whether you're in person or you're reading something or you're attending a program virtually. And we also really believe in community of support. We just think it helps a lot to connect. And as Dikla said, that might be connecting virtually, but we also think it's really great to connect in person. I'll never forget one of the first Living Beyond Breast Cancer conferences. I walked into the ladies' room and there were like 4 women with their shirts held up because they were all showing each other, you know, whether they were happy or not, but this is what my reconstruction looks like. And there was so much value in that. So, you know, that's our priority. But, you know, like with the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, they're bringing groups together to say, let's all work together, let's share resources, let's not duplicate efforts. Because I do think sometimes a lot of these organizations, we're all talking to the same people. We're all talking to the people who are naturally information seekers. You're gonna find us first, you know, but we need to dig deeper. Nick and I were talking about this for his work. We need to find people that are harder to reach and are more isolated, maybe don't have as much support. And then we need the politics too. We need people in Washington, and we need more money for research, and we need the SEER data. So I think as an advocate, or however any of you decide to become advocates, you need to sort of decide what is most meaningful to you, because I think in any way you engage, it's important, and it's got to be important to you. So there's lots to do. I don't know if I answered your question. Did I answer?
Kathy?
Okay, there's lots of, speaking of advocacy opportunities, there's lots of concern about costs of medicines, costs of, as you mentioned, genetic testing. What can be done?
Is that
I'm not sure which panel.
I'm the moderator, right? Okay, Dikla, go for it, please.
Dealing with the cost of medical care, especially in a metastatic setting where it's chronic, it's not a short-term affair, and so the finances over the long term can be extremely daunting, if not bankruptcy-inducing, and I've seen that a lot in the peer counseling I've done. Help with costs. There are some financial assistance organization, but it's still extremely lacking right now. Some best efforts are calling the pharmaceutical company directly, and they have programs that can help offset the cost. There's some national organizations that can help as well, and I'm sure that lbbc.com has resources to those organizations and connections. But from my experience, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot more financial assistance to anyone dealing with metastatic breast cancer, and hopefully living with it for a long time, and hopefully that not inducing the enormous stress of a financial burden and discomfort. It's very hard.
Go ahead.
I would like,
We all want
as
to
a
talk about
journalist, I would make a point too. I think sometimes, as much as there's hype, there's too much skepticism about new drugs. And I think some journalists diminish the value or underrepresent the value of drugs to individual patients. And I think that can be a disservice to the community, because there are people who benefit from drugs. I don't think people should get drugs they don't want, but I think it would be helpful not for journalists to exaggerate the benefit of drugs, but not to diminish those either, or to say it's hopeless, it's just too expensive, and so forth. I think that there needs to be fair representation of the potential value of drugs for individuals in the media. I think that would help the public's sort of position and view on this.
In the time that I've been working as an advocate, we've gone from everything for everyone to beginning to see that certain drugs only help patients with certain subtypes of breast cancer, right? This is now accepted. Probably since your own diagnosis, you've never known anything else, but believe me, everybody got everything. Early breast cancer patients with tumors of a certain size always got chemotherapy if they were getting any kind of adequate care. Times are changing, and this is, to me, the real promise of precision medicine is, the right drug for the right patient at the right time. I don't see any other way of saving money, actually, but going in that direction, and it has to be coupled by, and this is a uniquely, I think, American thing, this notion that we should have the right to have anything we want, regardless of the evidence of its efficacy. I think we have to demand good quality evidence and make sure that we're advocating for treatment that is backed up by high quality clinical trials evidence. Because there's really no other way that we're going to be able to combat, in my view, the cost issue.
May I just point out, in addition to that, to getting very specified treatment that's specific to our individual types of metastatic breast cancer, it's important in the research and in the funding to realize that we also, as patients, want to live long, but also want to live a good quality of life. It's not just surviving cancer, it's not just living with cancer, but as the name of this conference is, it's about thriving while dealing with metastatic breast cancer. Wouldn't it be nice to know, okay, I'm dealing with it, but it's not affecting my life at all, and I'm just doing my stuff? That would be perfect. That's why, for my Facebook group, that's what I named it. Thriving with advanced metastatic stage 4 breast cancer. No matter how many names we give it, that's what we want at the end of the day, to live normal lives without any burden of finances, side effects, chronically going to treatments or appointments, but living like we don't have cancer, even if we're dealing with it.
Okay. I think it's time to go to the reception. So on that really nice note, thank you, Dikla. I thank all of you for being here and on behalf, and for LBBC for sponsoring this meeting. I hope it's a really informative and fun and thriveful meeting for everyone. Enjoy the reception, and thank you all. All right.